Do you hear that? That isn't just water. That is the heartbeat of an impossible dream. Take a deep breath and listen. If I told you about a city, an empire that dominated the world for 1,000 years, a city with no land, no mines, no forests, no great army, a city built not on stone, but on liquid mud and salt water, you'd say I'm a liar. You'd say it's a fairy tale. And you'd be right. This is the greatest, most ambitious, and most brutal fairy tale ever written. This is the story of Venice. Our story doesn't begin with the trumpets of kings. It begins with a scream. It's the 5th century. The world as men knew it, the order of great Rome, is turning to ash. And from the east, a nightmare of flesh and bone is galloping. Attila and the Huns. These weren't warriors. They were a natural disaster. A storm of fire, iron, and wailing, consuming northern Italy. Cities are burning, civilization is collapsing. And the Roman people of that land, the Veneti, began to run. Desperate people, fleeing, leaving their homes, their land, their past. A flood of refugees running with nothing but pure terror. Where did they run? The wretched masses ran to the only place cavalry could not follow, out to the sea. They ran to an ending place, a forgotten place, a desolate, wind-swept lagoon. This was not a paradise. This was a hostile maze of mudflats, salt marshes, and shifting islands. It was cold. It was damp. It was empty. But this barren water gave them one gift, the most precious gift of all: safety. The shallow, confusing water was a natural fortress. The first inhabitants of the lagoon, they were not conquerors. They were fishermen, salt makers, people who had lost everything. Stay with them for a moment, in this moment. When you have lost everything, when the solid ground beneath your feet is gone, what do? Most people would despair, but these people, they did the opposite. And this is the first lesson that Venice, the city not yet born, taught humanity. The greatest resilience is not born from strength. It is born from absolute weakness. When you have nothing left to lose, you are truly free to create. Those fugitives had no earth to plow, so their vision turned to the sea. They had no walls to hide behind, so the water itself became their wall. Those resilient souls didn't just survive. They began to adapt. They began to dream. Time passes. The makeshift huts are no longer enough. The initial fear has given way to that stubborn human ambition to leave a mark. These settlers wanted stone houses. They wanted churches. They wanted a city that defied God himself. And the builders of the lagoon faced an impossible question. How do you make stone float on mud? You will not believe what those pragmatic minds did. It was an act of genius-born madness.
Crews sailed to the mainland, felling thousands, tens of thousands, then millions of oak and pine trees. They sharpened those trunks, and then they began the great work, driving them down. The pile drivers hammered them through the soft mud, down and down, until they struck a layer of hard, stable clay deep below. An entire city sunk, an entire forest into the lagoon. To build a single church, they drove 1 million piles. An entire community building a city on top of an upside-down forest. And the miracle? The beautiful paradox? In the salt-heavy, oxygen-poor water of the lagoon, those wooden piles did not rot. They petrified. They became as hard as iron. The very environment that was hostile and unstable, the very fatal weakness of the lagoon, became the eternal preservative for their foundations. This is the Venetian character, forged in this very moment. A Venetian is a master pragmatist. He does not fight nature. He does not impose his will upon it. He seduces it. He understands it. He takes its weakness and turns it in to his greatest strength. Their roads were canals. Their wagons were boats. The city born of fear now had a foundation built on defiance. It was ready to become a power.
As the small islands of the lagoon consolidated into a thriving city, a new fear arose, an old fear deep in their blood. Not the fear of nature, but the fear of human nature. These were the descendants of people who had fled tyrants on the mainland. The genetic fear in their blood was the fear of one-man rule, the fear of a king, a despot. But a growing city needs a leader. These founders had to solve a riddle. How do you have a head without giving him the power to become a tyrant? The solution those minds crafted wasn't just political. It was a masterpiece of systematic paranoia. The merchant aristocracy created the office of the Doge, a leader but not a king, a prince but not a sovereign. The Doge was elected for life by the most powerful families. He was not born to rule. But that was just the theater for the outside world. The true power in Venice did not rest with one man. It rested with the wealthy merchant families. And the greatest fear of these clans was an ambitious Doge. So the entire Venetian political system evolved into a complex, almost pathological machine designed by distrust just to prevent that. The Doge, the most powerful man in Venice, he lived in a splendid palace, and he was a gilded prisoner. Listen to this. A Doge could not name his own successor. His sons were forbidden to hold public office during his reign. His official mail had to be opened and read by state censors before he was allowed to see it. He, the Lord of the Sea, could not even leave the city of Venice without the permission of his own councils. This was a republic, but it was not a democracy. This was a cold, ruthless oligarchy.
This is the great paradox of Venice, a republic built on a foundation of absolute mistrust. And it worked. While the rest of Europe was constantly torn apart by the mad ambitions of kings, by civil wars and coups, Venice, by trusting no one, achieved near-perfect stability for 1,000 years. Those rulers turned suspicion into an art form. And to protect this machine of power, the families created a ghost, a secret and terrifying organization, the Council of Ten, a state security agency. Its mission? To root out betrayal. Its agents were everywhere. Citizens were encouraged to anonymously denounce their neighbors by slipping messages into stone boxes placed around the city, the infamous Bocche di Leone. Stability came at a price. And this stability, bought with suspicion and constant fear, allowed Venice to focus all its energy on one goal, a goal that would turn this refugee city into an empire. The city had tamed the mud. It had tamed human nature. Now it was time to tame the sea.
The powerful families of Venice had a city built from defiance. They had a government forged from suspicion. But they lacked one thing, something more important than stone and law. They lacked a soul. You see, the city's patron saint at the time was a second-rate figure, a minor Byzantine saint. It was an embarrassment, a constant reminder that spiritually, Venice was still a subordinate, a province of a greater empire. A city that wants to be great cannot have a second-rate saint. It needs a legend. And the pragmatic minds in Venice, in their boundless audacity, decided, if we do not have a legend, we will steal one. And their target? Not just any saint. They aimed for one of the men who wrote the book. They aimed for Saint Mark the Evangelist himself. Only one problem. A very big problem. His sacred remains lay in Alexandria, Egypt, under Muslim control. Anyone else would have seen this as impossible. But the Venetians, they saw it as an opportunity. The year is 828 AD. Picture the scene. Two Venetian merchants, Buono and Rustico. This was not a royal mission. This was a raid, an act of theft, dressed in the robes of piety, a sacred heist. These two men arrived in Alexandria. Through bribery, persuasion, and whispers of rescuing the relic from the infidels, they gained access to the tomb. They got the body, but the hard part was still ahead. How to get a major Christian saint past the Muslim guards at the port. And this is the most Venetian moment. Not by the sword, not with a battle, but with cunning. The two merchants placed the body of Saint Mark in a large basket, and then they covered it with pork and cabbage leaves. A profane act of genius. When the Muslim customs officials, who consider pork unclean, came to inspect the cargo, they recoiled in disgust. They waved them on. Go quickly. The ship was clear. These merchants had weaponized their enemies' own piety against them. That is Venice,
ruthlessly practical, terrifyingly smart. When the ship carrying St. Mark arrived in Venice, it wasn't just a celebration. It was a rebirth. The entire city erupted in joy. Venice was no longer a Byzantine province. They were a pilgrimage destination. They could stand equal with Rome itself. And immediately, the magnificent, golden first Basilica of St. Mark's was commissioned to be the new home for the relic. And immediately, the city had a new symbol. The traditional symbol of St. Mark is a winged lion. Venice adopted it as its own, the Lion of St. Mark, holding a book. It was stamped on their coins, flown on their warships, carved into every gate of every city they conquered. Think about this. The rulers of Venice understood a deep truth about power. Power isn't just what you have. It's what others believe you have. It's a story. And with one audacious, blasphemous theft, they stole the greatest story of all. They stole a skeleton, and in return, they gave their city an eternal soul.
They had a sacred soul. But a soul, no matter how great, needed a weapon. Venice's power was built on the sea, but the sea is a dangerous place. To dominate it, you need ships, hundreds of them, faster, stronger than any rival. How could a tiny city on a marsh with no forests of its own do it? The answer lay in the eastern corner of the city, hidden behind high red brick walls and guarded watchtowers. It was called the Arsenal. This was not a shipyard. It was an industrial nightmare, a monster. It was the largest, most efficient industrial complex in Europe, centuries ahead of its time. The true heart of Venice did not beat in the gilded St. Mark's Basilica. It bet here, in this red brick inferno. The genius of the Arsenal was one revolutionary idea: the assembly line, centuries before Henry Ford. While the rest of the world built one ship at a time from start to finish, the Venetians did it differently. They mass-produced standardized, interchangeable parts. Inside this massive complex, thousands of workers, the Arsenalotti. They weren't artisans. They were cogs in a giant machine. One shop made only oars. One shop only wove rope. One shop only forged anchors. Parts were stored by the thousands in massive warehouses, ready at a moment's notice. A bare, pre-built hull would be towed into a central canal. As it floated past each station, a specialized team would swarm it. This station, install the rowing benches. The next station, raise the masts and rig the sails. The final station, weapons, crossbows, and later the fearsome cannons cast in the arsenal's own foundry. The efficiency was staggering. It was said that in a display of power, a foreign official witnessed a new war galley fully assembled and armed in the time it took him to eat a leisurely dinner. At its peak, Venice could launch and fully equip a warship in a single day. Do you understand what that means? In wartime, Venice's enemy would send a spy. The report: they have 10 ships. A month later, when the enemy fleet arrived, they were met by 40 ships. It was an unassailable strategic advantage. It was a war machine lubricated by secrecy. The Arsenalotti were a special class. They were paid by the state for life, given pensions, given housing. In return, they owed total loyalty and total silence. The Arsenal was a fortress, not just against enemies, but against industrial espionage. This is the second paradox of Venice. The city of Renaissance art, of lavish carnivals, of fragile beauty, was propped up by the most ruthless, cold, and efficient industrial machine the world had ever seen. The Doge's palace may have been the brain, but the arsenal was its beating heart of timber and iron. It was the muscle. It was the weapon. And now, with its soul stolen and its weapon forged, Venice was ready for a performance.
A show, a grand piece of theater. Something to tell the world, we are the masters. And the Venetians, masters of spectacle, created the grandest ceremony of all. Every year on Ascension Day, the city held a unique ritual. It was called the Marriage to the Sea. The centerpiece of this festival was a ship, but this was no war galley. It was called the Bucentoro. It was a floating palace, a masterpiece of Venetian craft, a massive two-decker ship propelled by the finest rowers from the arsenal. Its entire surface was covered in elaborate carvings and coated in pure gold leaf. It was said that when it was brought out of its dock, it looked like a mountain of gold floating on the water. On the morning of the festival, the Doge, in his most magnificent robes, boarded the Bucentoro. He was followed by hundreds of other boats, lavishly decorated gondolas, private yachts. The air was filled with music, the pealing of church bells, and the cheers of the people. The great procession sailed to the mouth of the lagoon, where the calm waters met the open Adriatic Sea. And here, everything fell silent. The Doge stepped forward. He held a consecrated golden ring. He held it high for all to see. And then he spoke the unchanging, prideful vow in Latin. Desponsalos te mare, in signum veri perpetue qui dominie. We marry you, O sea, as a sign of true and perpetual dominion. With those words, he dropped the golden ring into the waves. Do you see the extraordinary arrogance in that act? Do you see the beauty of it? They did not ask the sea for permission. They claimed ownership of it. They did not pray for safety. They declared dominion. This was not a metaphor. This was a hard political statement performed with gold and ceremony. It said to popes, emperors, and sultans, "The Adriatic Sea is Venetian territory. It is our private highway, and we are its master." They had turned a magnificent declaration into an undeniable reality. They had married their own lifeline, and from that marriage, an empire was born. An empire that now had a soul, a weapon, and a golden crown, ready for its greatest conquest. At the dawn of the 13th century, a call rang out across Europe. Pope Innocent III had declared the Fourth Crusade. A new holy army of crusaders would march to reclaim Jerusalem. The feudal lords of France and the Holy Roman Empire answered the call. A magnificent army of knights was assembled. But they had a problem. A big one. They were land warriors. To attack the Muslim heartland in Egypt, they needed a fleet. And there was only one place in the world that could provide it. Only one place that could build their dream. The Venetian arsenal. The Crusader envoys arrived in Venice, and they met him.
The leader of Venice at this time was one of the most formidable figures of the Middle Ages. His name was Enrico Dandolo, the Doge of Venice. He was over 90 years old, and he was blind. But do not let the darkness in his eyes fool you. This blind old man's mind was sharper than any man half his age, and his ambition for Venice was bottomless. The knights made their request, a fleet to transport 33,000 and 4,500 horses. Dandolo and the Venetian merchants drove a hard bargain. They agreed. They would suspend all their normal commerce for over a year. They would commit the entire industrial might of the arsenal to this one massive project. The price? 85,000 silver marks, a staggering sum. The knights agreed. Venice went to work. Summer, 1202. The Crusader army arrives in Venice. A crisis explodes immediately. The army is much smaller than promised. Thousands of knights had chosen other routes or deserted, and as a result, they could not pay. They could only scrape together a fraction of the massive agreed-upon price. The situation was a disaster. A massive, heavily armed foreign army was now trapped on an island in the Venetian lagoon, unable to fulfill their holy vow. And Venice? It was on the brink of bankruptcy, with its entire expensive new fleet sitting idle in the harbor. And it was in this moment of crisis, that the blind Doge revealed his cunning genius. Enrico Dandolo made a proposal to the desperate knights. You can pay the rest of your debt, not in silver, but in service. The first target he announced would not be Egypt. It would be the city of Zara, a Christian city and a Venetian trade rival on the Dalmatian coast. The knights were stunned, horrified. They had taken a sacred vow to fight the enemies of God. Now they were being asked to attack a fellow Christian city for the commercial benefit of Venice. The Pope himself forbade the act. He threatened to excommunicate the entire army. But the knights were trapped, indebted, desperate, and the blind old Dandolo was relentless. For Venice, this was business. To seal the deal, Enrico Dandolo performed a masterstroke of political theater. In a grand ceremony at St. Mark's, he announced that he himself, despite his age and blindness, would personally take the cross and lead the crusade. The board was set. The gamble had paid off. That blind old man, in one cunning move, had hijacked the entire Fourth Crusade. He had replaced its sacred purpose with the cold, hard logic of Venetian ambition. The fleet set sail.
The terrible attack on Zara was just a ruthless prelude. The Christian city fell. The Crusader army, now stained, wintered in the conquered city. And it was during that cold, tense winter, the fate of the crusade was changed forever. A new player arrived, a young exiled Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos. He came to the Crusader leaders, and he made an offer, a spectacular offer. Listen to this temptation. He said, "Sail to Constantinople, help me reclaim my throne, and in return,
I will pay your entire debt to Venice. I will finance your onward journey to Egypt, and I will bring the Orthodox Church under the authority of the Pope in Rome. For the French and German knights, this was the perfect justification. They could solve their financial crisis and feel righteous about it. But for Dandolo, for Venice, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. Constantinople, the queen of cities, the wealthiest metropolis in the world, and also Venice's greatest, most hated commercial rival. The chance to place a puppet emperor, a debtor, on the throne of their rival was a prize for which Enrico Dandolo was willing to risk everything. Summer 1203, the great Crusader fleet appears before the legendary walls of Constantinople. The initial assault is a success. Prince Alexios is installed on the throne, but the victory is short-lived. The new emperor quickly discovered the treasury was empty. He could not pay the massive sums he had promised. Tensions exploded. The Crusader army felt betrayed. And then, an uprising in the city overthrew and killed the puppet emperor. Now, there was no hope of payment. The knights and the Venetians made a fateful decision. They would take their payment by force. April 1204, the all-out assault began. The Venetian fleet played a crucial role, turning their ships into floating siege towers, attacking the seawalls. The defenses were breached. The Crusader army poured into the wealthiest city in the Christian world. What happened next is one of the most shameful events in history: the Great Sack of Constantinople. For 3 days, the city was consumed by a frenzy of looting, destruction, and murder. Palaces and churches were stripped bare, robbed of priceless relics and ancient treasures. The Great Library was burned. Magnificent bronze statues were melted down for coins. And in the division of the spoils, Venice played the long, clever game. The French knights took land. Venice took what mattered most to a maritime empire. They took the 4 famed bronze horses, the future symbol for St. Mark's Basilica. They took control of 3/8 of Constantinople. And most importantly, they seized a chain of strategic ports and islands, including the key island of Crete. The Fourth Crusade never reached the Holy Land. It shattered the ancient Christian Byzantine Empire. It carved a permanent wound between the 2 branches of Christianity. And it made Venice rich beyond its wildest dreams. With the wealth of Constantinople in its treasury and the most strategic ports under its control, Venice was no longer just a powerful city-state. It was now an empire.
In the chaos after the sack of Constantinople, a great feast began. The French and German Crusader lords, the land warriors, scrambled. They greedily grabbed what they understood: land. They set up feudal kingdoms, duchies. They made themselves new kings of hostile, rebellious lands they did not understand. And the Venetians, the merchants of the lagoon, quietly laughed. Those pragmatic minds knew a truth the knights never grasped. Land is a burden. Land is trouble. Land requires expensive, occupying armies. The sea is power. So while the knights redrew the map of the land, the Venetians redrew the map of the ocean itself. From the ashes of the Byzantine Empire, Venetian strategists meticulously crafted a new kind of empire.
an empire designed by merchants for merchants. They called it the Stato da Mar, the Empire of the Sea. Their strategy was a genius of efficiency. They did not take territory, they took trade routes. They created a long, unbroken chain of fortified ports and islands. It was like a chain of pearls, where every pearl was a naval fortress, a supply station, a commercial outpost. It was a maritime highway, stretching from Venice all the way to the Black Sea. They took the key ports along the Greek coast. They took the Aegean islands, and they secured the jewel in the crown, the massive, strategic island, Crete. This was not an empire of settlement. This was a commercial and military machine. Each island was a safe harbor where merchant ships could rest, resupply, and shelter from storms. Each fortress was a naval base where warships could patrol, enforcing Venice's will upon the sea lanes. And this was the ultimate expression of the Venetian worldview. They had built their city on water, and now they built their empire on water too. They didn't care about ruling millions of peasants. They cared about one thing: control. Control of the flow of wealth from east to west. This machine, this glittering chain of pearls, was the hard skeleton, the pipeline, to suck all the world's riches back to its beating heart, St. Mark's Square. And this machine paved the way for the greatest journey of all. If the Stato da Mar was the highway, it was time for a Venetian to drive that car to the very end of the earth. His name was Marco Polo. The year 1271, he was just a 17-year-old boy joining his father and uncle, merchants, on an ambitious trading mission. But this was not a quick sea voyage. This was an arduous overland trek, a journey that lasted 3.5 years. Imagine that. 3.5 years crossing the mountains of Anatolia, the deserts of Persia, and climbing the roof of the world, the mighty Pamir Mountains. And finally, they arrived. They reached the lavish, almost mythical court of Kublai Khan, the great Khan of the Mongols, Emperor of China. The Khan was a sophisticated ruler, and he was fascinated by these strange men from the far west. He took a special liking to the young Marco Polo, and for the next 17 years, 17 years, Marco Polo was not just a merchant, he became an emissary, an honored official in the great Khan's vast empire. This young Venetian boy traveled all over China. He saw wonders no European had ever witnessed. Great cities, larger than anything in Europe. The burning of black stones, coal for heat. The use of paper money, a concept utterly alien to the West. 24 years after leaving his home, the Polos were finally allowed to return. The journey back, this time by sea, was just as perilous. And when they landed in Venice in 1295, no one recognized them. They were ragged, dressed like Mongols. Their own family didn't believe it was them.
And then the legend. To prove their story, they ripped open the seams of their rough coats, and a river of priceless rubies, sapphires, and diamonds poured out on the table, the hidden fortune they had amassed from the East. But Marco Polo's incredible adventure had one final, ironic twist. A few years after his return, Venice went to war again, this time with its mortal rival, Genoa. Marco, now a wealthy man, commanded his own galley. In the battle, the Venetians were crushed, and Marco Polo was taken prisoner. Thrown into a Genoese prison. Think of the irony. The man who had seen the world, the guest of the greatest emperor, the man who brought back a fortune in gems, now locked in a dark, damp cell of his enemy. But it was there, in that darkness, that the greatest thing happened. To pass the time, Marco Polo dictated his entire story to a fellow prisoner, a writer named Rustichello, and that book, The Travels of Marco Polo, was born. Many at the time scoffed, calling it the Million Lies. But it was the first detailed, factual description of the Far East. It was more than a diary. It was a map. It was the spark that would inspire future explorers, including Christopher Columbus. A Venetian merchant, locked in his enemy's dungeon, ended up changing the map of the world. The war with Genoa put Marco Polo in prison, but that war was not over. A final, brutal struggle was needed to decide who was the true master of the Mediterranean.
This is a survival thriller. The tone must start at rock bottom, desperate, bleak, and terrified. It then must build into a furious, cornered animal resilience. The climax is not celebratory, but a tense, brilliant, high-stakes gamble that pays off. The rivalry between Venice and Genoa wasn't just business. It was personal. They were two halves of one soul, two lions of the sea, born on opposite sides of Italy. They were so alike, they could not coexist. A final brutal war was needed to settle the ancient blood feud, the War of Chioggia. Year 1378. The Genoese fleet, in a brilliant, audacious tactical move, did the unthinkable. The one thing no enemy had ever dared to dream. They sailed into the Venetian lagoon itself. Do you understand what that means? The natural fortress, the shallow water that had protected the city from the very beginning, had been breached. The Genoese fleet smashed the outer defenses and captured the strategic port of Chioggia at the lagoon's own southern doorstep. This was the darkest hour of the Republic. For the first time in its 1,000-year history, Venice was besieged in its own home. The enemy was at the gates. The Genoese admiral, arrogant with confidence, sent a message to the panicked Doge. He declared there would be no peace until he had put a bridle on the Lion of St. Mark, a promise of total conquest. In this final moment of desperation, the Republic did what only the desperate dare to do. It fought back. The greatest comeback in naval history was about to begin. The entire city roared in defiance. Every ship, every man was mobilized. And they did one thing. They went to the prison and released their best admiral, Vettor Pisani, who had been jailed for an earlier failure. Pisani, the disgraced hero, now held the city's fate in his hands. And he proposed the craziest gamble, a plan that could only be born of utter desperation. Not to break the siege, but to blockade the blockaders themselves. Under the cover of night, the last Venetian fleet sailed south. They did not attack the Genoese fleet. They went around them. They reached the narrow sea channels, the only escape route from the Chioggia lagoon, where the Genoese fleet was anchored. And there, the Venetians sank their own old, heavy ships filled with stone, right in the mouths of the channels. They sealed the exits. The entire Genoese fleet, the victors of a moment before, was now trapped inside the very harbor they had just conquered. The tables had turned completely. The siege of Venice had become the siege of Chioggia. For 6 months, 6 grueling, brutal months, the Venetians, now the jailers, held their positions. They cut off all supplies, all food, to the trapped Genoese fleet. It became a war of endurance. Who will starve first? Finally. Starving with no hope of rescue, the once mighty Genoese fleet was forced to surrender. A humiliating and total surrender. Victory was complete. The War of Chioggia broke the spine of Genoese sea power forever. Their great rival was eliminated from the game. Venice now stood alone, unchallenged, the undisputed master of the Mediterranean trade. Think about this. Venice's greatest victory didn't come in Constantinople. It came when they were cornered in their own home. They won because they had no other choice. They turned their prison into their weapon. And having defeated its last rival, the Republic was now truly free to enter its golden age.
Genoa was crushed. The last rival was eliminated. Venice now stood alone in a glorious silence, the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. And when you are the master, you get the spoils. Throughout the Middle Ages and Renaissance, the real wealth wasn't gold. Gold was just how you paid for things. The real wealth was spice. Such a small word, isn't it? Spice. We think of cinnamon, of pepper, but you have to understand, for Europe at the time, this wasn't about seasoning food. This was magic powder. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, they were medicine. They were meat preservatives, the only thing that got people through the winter. They were the ultimate status symbol. A small bag of peppercorns was worth a man's entire working life. A pound of nutmeg was often worth more than a pound of gold. Their source was a secret, shrouded in the mists of the faraway Spice Islands, a place no European had ever seen. And for centuries, Venice had made itself the only gatekeeper. The machine was set, the Silk Road of the sea. Spices were shipped by Arab and Indian sailors across the Indian Ocean, moved onto camel caravans across the desert, and finally, they arrived at the great ports of Egypt and Syria. And there, at the very doorstep of Europe, the Venetians were waiting. Through shrewd diplomatic treaties with the sultans of Egypt, Through the brute force of their naval fleet, which dominated every corner of the sea, Venice had established an absolute monopoly. No other European power could touch the source. All of Europe, if it wanted the hot bite of pepper or the sweet scent of cinnamon, had to buy it from Venice at the price Venice demanded. Can you imagine it? Can you smell it? When a spice convoy returned, the massive merchant galleys, sails full, coming home, their cargo holds not full of gold, but of the priceless aromatic dust that was the foundation of the Republic. They docked at the Rialto, the air filled with the scent of the Orient, and the money, a river of gold, began to pour into the city's treasuries. The wealth was unimaginable. What did that wealth finance? It financed the magnificent marble palaces along the Grand Canal. It financed the priceless paintings of Titian and Veronese. It financed even mightier war fleets, forged in the arsenal. The city of refugees, the city built on mud from fear, was now the most glittering jewel on earth, a city built on a mountain of spice. They had reached the pinnacle, and as fate always dictates, just as you stand on the highest peak, a new threat from an unexpected direction was beginning to emerge.
Venice's success had created a new, fatal flaw. For centuries, every threat to the Republic had come from the sea. It was a challenge they had mastered. They were masters of that game. But now, as they were busy counting their profits from the east, a new, dangerous beast was growing right behind them, on the Italian mainland itself. Powerful, aggressive city-states were unifying. The largest of them, the Duchy of Milan, ruled by the ambitious and expansionist family of Visconti. Milan's goal was to conquer all of northern Italy. And the strategic minds in Venice suddenly realized a terrifying truth. The lagoon was no longer a perfect fortress. Why? What could a powerful enemy controlling the mainland do? He could starve Venice. He could cut off the city's vital food supply. He could cut off the land trade routes running from Venice over the Alps to the rest of Europe. The sea had made them rich, but the land could kill them. This new threat caused a soul-tearing debate inside the Doge's palace. Two factions formed. One side, the traditionalists, the men of the sea, warned, Venice is a creature of the sea. To get involved in the costly, treacherous land wars of Italy is a fatal mistake. It will betray our very nature. The other side, the pragmatists, the expansionists, countered, we have no choice. To keep our own stomachs safe, Venice must control its backyard. We need a deep, defensive buffer on the mainland. The struggle was fierce. In the end, the expansionists won. The early 14th century, Venice made a fundamental change in its grand strategy. The Republic turned its back on the sea and began a series of costly wares to conquer the territory behind it. It was the birth of the Stato da Terra, the land empire. The initial conquest was swift. Venice captured Padua,
then Vicenza, and finally the great city of Verona. For the first time, Venice controlled the great rivers and the fertile farmlands. For the first time, the city had secured its own food supply. This was a seismic shift. Venice was no longer just a maritime empire. It was now also a major Italian land power. But this land that had given them security, would also drag them into a century of brutal, complex, and ruinously expensive land wars. It was a completely different kind of conflict, a kind of war their sailors did not know how to fight. And it would require a new, terrifying kind of warrior.
Venice had committed to a new future, a future of conquest on the Italian mainland. But the Republic of Merchants faced a critical problem. Their citizens were sailors, shipbuilders, and traders. They were not professional land soldiers. And Italian land warfare in the Renaissance was a brutal, complex game. To fight in this game, Venice, like the other Italian states, had to turn to the masters of Renaissance warfare, the condottieri. Who were they? A condottiero was a professional mercenary captain. He did not fight for patriotism, he did not fight for a king. He fought for a contract, la condotta, a legal document specifying his pay, the number of men he would provide, and the length of his service. These men were businessmen of violence. They ran their own private companies that specialized in war, complete with heavy cavalry and infantry. They were minor nobles, ambitious risk-takers who saw war as the fastest path to wealth, power, and fame. This system created a unique kind of warfare. It was a business transaction. A condottiero's most precious asset was his veteran soldiers and his expensive horsebacks. He was often reluctant to risk those assets in bloody, decisive battles that could wipe out his army and his livelihood. So warfare often became a slow, complex chess match of maneuvering, long sieges, and strategic standoffs. The goal was to outsmart the opponent, to take territory with minimal losses. And, of course, betrayal was common. A captain might switch sides in the middle of a war if a rival state offered him a better contract. And now, imagine, you are Venice, a nation built on stability, a machine designed around paranoia and the absolute distrust of any single individual. Your greatest fear is that a powerful, popular general could become a military dictator and overthrow the republic. And now, to defend itself, you are forced to hire the exact kind of man you fear the most. You are handing the sword of the state into the hands of hired wolves whose only loyalty is to gold. This paradox was agonizing. The pragmatic Venetian rulers used mercenaries because they had to, but they never, for 1 second, trusted them. The Republic constantly spied on its own generals. They sent political officials to the battlefield not to fight, but to watch the general and report back to the terrifying Council of 10. And to understand this cold paranoia, you only need to hear one story, the tragic story of the great general Francesco Busoni, known as Carmagnola. Carmagnola was a military genius, a brilliant condottiero originally serving Venice's greatest enemy, Milan. Venice spent a fortune to poach him, And he did not disappoint. He won glittering victories for the Republic. He became a hero, celebrated by the people. And for Venice, hero was a synonym for threat. The state began to doubt his loyalty. They questioned his lack of aggression in later campaigns. They suspected he was secretly communicating with his old masters in Milan. And in 1432, the paranoid machine of Venice acted with ice-cold precision. They did not accuse him. They did not confront him. They invited their celebrated general back to the city, ostensibly to discuss future strategy. Carmagnola, suspecting nothing, returned. He was greeted with all honors at the Doge's palace. He was led into a side room. And as he passed through, the doors were slammed and locked behind him. The trap. He was arrested by order of the Council of Ten. After a secret trial for treason, he was found guilty. Days later, Carmagnola, the great hero of Venice, was led out into the Piazza San Marco and publicly beheaded between the two great columns. That was a message, a brutal, clear message to all who would serve the Republic. Venice will use your talent. Venice will pay you in gold. Venice will celebrate you. But Venice will never trust you. And if you falter even for a second, the machine will devour you. That was the violent, paranoid world of Renaissance land warfare. That was the bloody price Venice had to pay to forge and protect their land empire. And the story of Venice is always a story of contrasts. While their hired generals were fighting brutally on the dusty plains of Italy, the very city they were protecting was being transformed by that river of gold from the east. That incredible wealth, it wasn't just funding war. It was creating a unique and spectacular way of life.
While the hired wolves were bleeding on the mainland, inside the city was another world. A river of gold and spice flowed from the east, and that wealth wasn't just funding war. It was creating a unique lifestyle, a culture of luxury. And no symbol encapsulates the soul of this city more than its most famous boat, the gondola. It's not just a boat, it's a work of subtle genius. For centuries, the canals were the streets, and the gondola evolved to be the perfect vehicle for this unique environment. It's long and slender to glide through the narrowest canals. It has a flat bottom to pass over shallow water. But this is the magic. If you look closely, the hull is asymmetrical. It's built intentionally curved to one side. Why? That very asymmetry, that deliberate wrongness, is what allows a single rower standing at the back with one oar to propel the boat perfectly straight. Again, do you see it? The Venetian paradox. Just as the city was built on the wrong foundation of mud to achieve stability, its boat is built intentionally wrong to achieve perfect balance. That is wisdom forged from water. But human nature is human nature. By the height of the Renaissance, the gondola became a status symbol. Wealthy, noble families began to compete fiercely to see who owned the most extravagant boat. They decorated them with lavish brocades, intricate carvings, and covered them in gold leaf. The canals turned into a parade of boastfulness, a race of egos. And the machine, the paranoid machine, the Venetian state, watched this, and it hated what it saw.
It hated showiness. It hated individualism. It hated anything that allowed one noble to appear superior to another. Because that competition was the very seed of division and personal ambition, the very thing the Republic was designed to destroy. And so, in 1562, the state acted, not with a sword, but with a decree, a sumptuary law, a law designed to curb wasteful spending. The decree was simple. All gondolas, except for a few state ceremonial boats, must be stripped of all decoration and must be painted one single color. A simple, uniform color: black. Think about that. The cold genius of that decision. The state enforced a public image of Republican equality. It forced the city's powerful nobles to hide their boundless wealth behind a curtain of uniformity. A city of outward modesty hiding a world of private luxury. The black gondola became a symbol of the Venetian state's total control over the public and private lives of its citizens. And that obsession with control, it didn't just stop at the canals. It extended into the most sacred and dangerous realm of all: human faith.
Across Renaissance Europe, the Catholic Church had a powerful and terrifying tool to enforce its doctrine. It was called the Inquisition, a special court tasked with finding and punishing heretics, those whose beliefs ran counter to the official church teaching. A word that could make entire kingdoms tremble. But Venice, as always, did things its own way. The Republic was a devoutly Catholic state, but it was notorious for insisting on running a state-controlled Inquisition. Why? Why defy the power of Rome itself? The answer, as always in Venice, was not theology. It was pragmatism. It was business. This city was built on international trade. It was a cosmopolitan melting pot, filled with foreign merchants, German Lutherans, Greek Orthodox, Jews. A fanatical, Rome-controlled Inquisition could cause diplomatic incidents. It could interrupt the vital trade relationships that were the city's lifeblood. And for Venice, commercial stability was just as important as religious purity. So, the Venetian system was unique. The court included religious figures, including the Pope's nuncio. But there was a key difference. 3 lay observers were required to be present at every single trial. They were Venetian nobles appointed by the state, called the Savi al-Eresia. These men did not have a vote on the verdict, but their presence ensured that the state monitored every proceeding. They were the eyes and ears of the Council of 10. They could suspend a trial if they felt it was politically motivated or damaging to Venetian interests. The result, the Venetian Inquisition, was, in general, less brutal, more pragmatic. It focused on public repentance, on compliance, rather than mass executions. This independence caused constant tension with the Pope in Rome. The Pope saw Venice's state-controlled Inquisition as a challenge to his authority. And he was right. It was a challenge. The Venetian Inquisition
was a perfect example of the Republic's unique character. A city that was both deeply pious and fiercely independent. A city that found a way to balance the demands of faith with the practical needs of running a global merchant empire. Even in the sacred, terrifying matter of heresy, Venice's final loyalty was to the state and to the stability of the Republic. But that stability, so carefully protected from within, was about to face its greatest, most unstoppable threat from without.
Venice's golden age was built on its control of the East. But in the 15th and 16th centuries, a new, terrifying power had risen in the East: the Ottoman Empire. In 1453, an event shook the foundations of the world. Constantinople, the city Venice itself had once brutalized, had fallen to the Sultan. A powerful, aggressive Muslim superpower now directly controlled Venice's vital trade routes. What followed was a century of relentless, grinding warfare. One by one, the pearls in Venice's empire of the sea came under attack. The Republic found itself in a hideously expensive existential war to defend its empire from the monstrous power of the Ottomans. This war came to a climax in 1570. The Ottomans launched a massive invasion of the rich, strategic Venetian-held island of Cyprus. And Venice, the queen of the sea, for the first time knew it could not fight alone. The Republic sent desperate pleas across Europe. In response, a holy league was formed. The fleets of Spain, of the papacy, joined with Venice to confront the Turkish menace. The result was the largest naval battle ever fought in the West since antiquity, the Battle of Lepanto. Autumn 1571. Two colossal fleets met off the coast of Greece. An unbelievable sight. Over 200 Ottoman galleys facing a Christian fleet of similar size. A forest of masts and banners. This would be the last great battle fought primarily with oar-powered galleys. And at the center of the Venetian fleet were 6 revolutionary weapons. 6 monsters born from the industrial heart of the arsenal. They were called galleasses, massive, taller, hybrid ships armed with a staggering number of cannons, floating fortresses. As the battle began, these 6 galleasses were towed out in front of the line, and they unleashed a hell, a storm of cannon fire that smashed the Ottoman formation before the 2 main fleets even collided. What followed was a brutal, bloody melee. For hours, galleys rammed into each other, hooked onto each other. The battle turned into desperate hand-to-hand combat on blood-soaked decks.
The Christian fleet, with its superior firepower, slowly gained the upper hand. Spanish and Venetian soldiers captured the Ottoman flagship. The admiral was killed. The sight of the admiral's banner falling sent a wave of panic. The battle turned into a rout. The victory at Lepanto was absolute. The Ottoman fleet was annihilated. Thousands of Christian galley slaves were freed from their oars. News of the victory set off wild celebrations all across Europe. For Venice, it was a moment of supreme pride. It was their last great, heroic victory on the world stage. But the victory was hollow. The Holy League soon fell apart due to political infighting. Venice, left alone, was eventually still forced to concede the island of Cyprus in a peace treaty. The great victory at Lepanto was a stunning military achievement, an epic. But it could not reverse the slow tide of history. It was a glorious roar of an old lion. Because the real threat to Venice's future was not an Ottoman fleet, but a new map being drawn by the daring explorers of a rival nation.
At the end of the 15th century, Venice's wealth was built on one thing: monopoly. All of Europe had to buy its spice from Venice. But for decades, on the other side of Europe, the Kingdom of Portugal had been quietly investing in another path, an obsessive idea. They funded voyages, pushing further and further down the unknown coast of Africa. They developed new, tougher ships, like the Caravel, designed to withstand the brutal Atlantic. Their goal was to find a direct sea route to India and to break the Venetian monopoly forever. In 1498, an explorer named Bartolomeu Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope. He had proven the Indian Ocean could be reached. The path was open. A decade later, in 1497, a stubborn Portuguese captain named Vasco da Gama set sail from Lisbon with 4 small ships to finish the mission. His journey was an epic of survival: storms, scurvy, warfare. And finally, after 10 grueling months at sea, in May of 1498, his tattered fleet dropped anchor at the port of Calicut, India. He had done it. For the first time, a European navigator had sailed from Europe to India. The news traveled slowly. First, as a whisper in the marketplaces, then as a terrifying fact in diplomatic letters. When the news was finally announced in Venice, it was met with sheer horror. One Venetian diarist, Geronimo Prioli, wrote, "This is the worst news that the Republic could have ever received." The city's far-sighted merchants immediately understood the catastrophe. Their entire economic model, their entire reason for being, was now obsolete. Why? Why pay Venice's extortionate price for spice that had passed through 10 middlemen when the Portuguese could ship it directly to Lisbon for a fraction of the cost? The foundation of Venice's wealth had crumbled. This is the true tragedy. Venice was not defeated in a great battle. Venice was not conquered. Venice was simply ignored. The world had changed. The economic center of the world was shifting from the familiar waters of the Mediterranean to the vast, unknown expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The Great Age of Discovery, ironically, became the cause for the slow, irreversible decline of Venice.
The foundation of wealth had crumbled, but the city did not crumble with it. It did not fall into ruin. No. Instead, facing a world that no longer needed it as a marketplace, the Republic began its great and final transformation. The minds of Venice decided, if we can no longer be the most powerful city in the world, we will become the most beautiful, seductive, and entertaining city in the world. As its political power faded, its cultural power exploded. Venice became the essential destination on the Grand Tour, a rite of passage for wealthy young men from all over Europe. They came not for commercial power, but for its art treasures, its soaring music, and its legendary reputation for refined, decadent freedom. The ultimate expression of this new identity was the Carnival of Venice. It wasn't a short festival. It was a season, lasting for months of masquerade balls and public revelry that consumed the entire city. And at its heart was the mask. Behind a simple paper mask, a noble could mix with a commoner. A commoner could feel like a king. Anonymity dissolved the rigid social structures. It created an atmosphere of intrigue, romance, and illicit adventure in the labyrinth of alleys. This was the age Venice became the undisputed capital of pleasure. The city opened the Western world's first public, legal casino. It was the golden age of the Venetian courtesans, famously educated women. It was the birthplace of public opera. It was the city of the composer Antonio Vivaldi. It was also the city of the painter Canaletto, who painted breathtakingly detailed views of the Grand Canal and St. Mark's Square. Those paintings became the ultimate souvenirs for the tourists, and they cemented the image of Venice in the world's mind for centuries. As the 18th century came to a close, Venice was a breathtakingly beautiful city, and it was also a city of profound political stagnation. The Republic had become a living museum, a capital of pleasure, but its military was a shadow. Its ancient oligarchic government was unequipped to deal with the new violent forces about to be unleashed on Europe. The paranoid machine had grown old, and a guest, uninvited, was at the gates.
That new force was the French Revolution, and its instrument was a young, brilliant, and utterly ruthless general, Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1796, Napoleon's revolutionary army swept through northern Italy. The Venetian Republic, clinging to its ancient tradition of neutrality, tried desperately to stay out of the conflict. But in this new age of warfare, there was no place for neutrality. Napoleon, having conquered the surrounding lands, accused Venice of secret hostility to France. He marched to the very edge of the lagoon. For the first time in over 1,000 years, a hostile army stood at the shore of Venice. Napoleon delivered a final ultimatum to the Doge and the Great Council. They must dissolve their ancient government and form a new democratic municipality aligned with France. If they refused, I will be an Attila for the Venetian state. The threat was clear: surrender or face total destruction. The final agonizing debate took place in the Doge's palace. The ruling families of Venice gathered in the Great Council. Their faces were pale with fear. They knew the reality. Their tiny army was no match for Napoleon's hardened veterans. Their city could not defend itself against modern artillery. They faced an impossible choice: a heroic but suicidal resistance that would see their glorious city burned and looted, or a silent, humiliating surrender that might at least preserve the city itself. On May 12th, 1797, the last Doge of Venice, Ludovico Manin, addressed the council with tears in his eyes. He told them the Republic was finished. He urged them to accept the French terms. As the voting was being taken, the sound of musket fire outside sent a wave of panic. Believing a revolt had begun, or that the French were already attacking, the nobles, the descendants of the men who built the empire, voted in a hasty, undignified scramble. The 1,000-year Republic of Venice did not end with a roar of defiance. It ended with a whimper of fear. The final moments were quiet. Doge Ludovico Manin returned to his private chambers. He took off the Doge hat, the symbol of 1,000 years of power. He handed it to his servant and said simply, "Take it. I will not be needing it again." Days later, French troops marched into St. Mark's Square. For the first time, a foreign army occupied the city. They looted its treasures. They took the 4 great bronze horses and shipped them to Paris. The magnificent golden Bucentoro was smashed and burned for its gold. The Republic was dead.
The Venetian state was dead. The political and military power was gone forever. But the city, the idea of Venice, remains. Its true legacy is not in its fleets, but in the deep, lasting mark it left on the world. You can find that legacy in our own language.
the language of modern finance and commerce. The word bank comes from bunca, the bench the Venetian merchants used for their trade. The accounting terms debit and credit were perfected in their ledgers. And the word quarantine comes from 40 giorni, the 40 days that Venice required ships to isolate to fight the plague. But the most tangible legacy is the city itself. To walk through Venice today is to walk through a living museum. To stand in St. Mark's Square is to stand in the Republic's living room. You can cross the Bridge of Sighs into the grim prisons. You can see the red walls of the arsenal and imagine the industrial machine that once launched a fleet in a day. The footprint of the Lion of St. Mark is carved in stone all across the Mediterranean. In Crete, in Corfu, in Croatia, the great sea fortresses, the mighty walls of the land empire, stone reminders of a city that once commanded the seas. In the end, Venice's greatest legacy is its story. It is the story of a community born from fear, in a place with no natural advantages, that used cunning, ruthless pragmatism, and paranoid stability to become one of the most powerful and influential nations on Earth. The Lion of St. Mark no longer rules an empire, but the spirit of the impossible city, built on water, the Most Serene Republic, continues to exist as a timeless testament to human resilience and ambition. And so, our story of Venice comes to an end. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. I wish you a peaceful night.